Hi, welcome back, everybody. I hope you've had a chance to make some tea or, like me, grab some chocolates. Really pleased to be able to hand over to Keri, who's going to introduce a session on possibility and plurality.
So, hello everybody, welcome back. Those of you who've been with us and gone away and had a break, and hello to those who might be new just joining this session. It's great to be here, and we've had some fantastic conversations so far today. At the heart of what we've been talking about is, as we talk about imagination, has been this question of how do we perceive possibility? And I think we can see that in the last session, we've got a whole bunch of people who are able to see and perceive the possibility for reshaping and remaking cities, urban societies, relations. We've seen people who are able to perceive the possibility of love in the conditions of really challenging conditions. So, you know, this question of what possibility is and how we perceive it is really at the heart of what we're talking about today. In this session, we're going to take a step back from the practice to step back and think about how do we make sense of this idea of possibility and our capacity to sense it. We're going to pull back to some philosophy, to some theory, and we're going to think about if there are any principles that we might be able to draw out from this work. Over the last few years, there's been a huge and growing academic interest in this question of how we think about possibility and in really trying to unpick it. And there are a couple of really significant traditions that I wanted to bring together in this conversation. The first is an anthropological tradition, Latin American, drawing on social movements and design practice. And the second is the field of sociocultural theory, a psychological approach that starts with, if you like, imagination and possibility as something that happens in the mind. And so today we've got leading lights of these two movements that we're able to put into conversation for the first time. And I know that they've not been in this dialogue with each other before. So I'm really delighted to invite them. So if I can ask you guys to turn on your cameras, that would be wonderful. So just to introduce our speakers today, we have Arturo Escobar, who's Professor Emeritus of Anthropology at the University of North Carolina. And Arturo's history is a fascinating pathway from engineering and food science to development and anthropology. Many of you will know him from his groundbreaking work on critiquing Northern development models in his work Encountering Development. And more recently in his work, I see you describe yourself, Arturo, as a researcher activist. So more recently in his work in partnership with Afro-Colombian activists and in connection with the World Social Forum, he's given us this really important idea of the pluriverse, which I'm sure we will be unpacking today. Vlad Glaveanu is a professor of psychology at Dublin City University. He's the founder and president of the Possibility Studies Network. He's been drawing together research on creativity, imagination, culture, collaboration, wonder, possibility, awe, and societal challenges. He has a frankly unreasonable number of books to his name for somebody at this stage. And he's covering everything from creativity and culture to imagination and the possible. And he's helping us to think about how mind and imagination emerge in interaction with the world. So I'm really delighted to bring these two fantastic thinkers together. So what I'm going to do is begin by inviting them to sketch out for themselves what they understand by the meaning of this word possibility and why it's so important to you in your work and to the world. And these are impossible questions to ask of people. So we'll just recognize we'll scratch the surface for the time being. We'll then move into a deeper conversation where we're going to run through everything from dark imagination, the bad side of possibility, to thinking about questions of hope and social relations. So Arturo, if you'd like to begin. Oh, we need to unmute Arturo, please. Somebody.
Great.
Perfect.
Sorry about that. Can you hear me now?
Well, yeah, we can hear you. That's great.
Okay, wonderful. So hello to everybody. Greetings to everybody, whatever and in whatever time zone you are. I would like to start by thanking Keri for the invitation to be here, Gabriela, Vlad for sharing this, which I'm really glad to share this with Vlad. and the staff of the foundation, Cassie, Mona, and Seppi also for the support. And I want to start by saying that I really welcome this opportunity to talk about possibility, because I think one of the most important questions that we can ask today is precisely that. Who gets to imagine possible futures? Who gets to imagine the future articulated by Sophie Parker in the website of the foundation? We can ask the question as well in the following way: who is doing the important cultural political work of imagining the future, or the possible and hence the future? And I say that this is one of the most challenging and complex questions that we can face today, whether we are an academic or an activist or a policymaker. And my argument is going to be the following: that first, my remarks, I'm going to focus on the relationship between commonly held notions of reality on the one hand, what we think the real to be, and our sense of the future and the possible. There is a tight relationship between notions of reality and notions about the possible and the future. So my argument is the following: that there is a tight connection between the effects of the dominant socio-economic and cultural system, or that one of the most damaging effects of that system has been precisely to give us a very narrow notion of reality that forecloses the imagination of possible futures. This is why actually possibility studies is emerging, and my remarks here should be seen as a contribution to that field of studies, as outlined wonderfully by Vlad in his manifesto. So I'm going to make some very general propositions, 6 propositions or 7. So bear with me for now, and hopefully we'll be able to discuss them more in the conversation. So the first proposition is that the crux of possibility studies is to imagine possibility differently, obviously. And there are 2 aspects to this question. The first is that to think about how the possible has been thought and is thought today in the modern West, especially under what historical constraints has possibility has been thought about. This is important to create a space, or to clear the ground for the second task, which is actually the task of imagining possibility differently. We cannot do that without the other. Second, my hypothesis is that the incredibly complex civilizational process known as European modernity, that has been around for the past 500 years and has become a global project, has produced a very narrow notion of reality, holding us back from imagining different possibles and better futures. And actually, a main reason for the success of modernity has been precisely that, narrowing the sense of reality so as to narrowing the sense of the possible in particular ways. Why is that so? And this is point number 3. Because modernity was built on a story of separation, the separation between humans and nature, anthropocentrism, the separation between mind and body, rationalism, the separation between us and them, colonialism. And this worldview produced very powerful beliefs, but that are also very problematic. The belief in science as the main arbiter of truth, the belief in the isolated or competitive individual as the kernel of society, and the belief in the economy as separate from the rest of social life. But we know that the individual doesn't exist as an isolated entity, is deeply enmeshed in relations, and so is the economy. Number 4, as with the spread of this modern worldview and sense of reality worldwide, it also created the idea that we all live within a single reality, a single world that we all share, that we can know objectively through science. It's like we can stand outside from reality and look at it is, because we have science, and determine what that reality is once and for all, and hence what the possibilities might be, or the best possibilities might be. But as we more and more become aware that that's an illusion, that we cannot really stand detached from reality, we're completely connected to the real, to the world, to the body, to mind, body, world, are completely connected. So the famous scientific detachment and objectivity are also an illusion. Number 5, This notion of reality, and this is one of the most important points, is a simplification of a much more complex real or reality, what we can call the real. The real, what is the real? The real is the endlessly flow of life that is always changing and producing forms and everything that we see around in the world, and that has produced the planet that we share. So we obviously, all groups of people have cut up, have parceled out that endless flow of life into chunks to be able to order it and knowing it. But we are now seeing the consequences of that cutting off of reality in that particular way in modernity with climate crisis and everything else. And historically, moreover, there are many other ways of understanding the real, which means that there are many other realities and many other reals. So there are multiple realities, multiple reals, which is one of the ideas of the pluriverse. There isn't a single world, there is a world of many worlds. This is the final point. The worldview of a single reality and a single world is profoundly defuturing. This is a term from Australian designer Tony Fry. It reduces the future to a narrow set of possibilities, projections of what we already know. Okay, so these modern notions of reality and the real have rendered other possibles into impossibles or into non-credible alternatives to what is or to what exists. So it reduces always the reality, especially the reality of marginalized peoples and dreamers and poets, to be non-realistic, to be non-feasible, to be romantic, to be all these different things. So we might need to decolonize that notion, the real, by examining carefully this particular modern notion of reality. That's what in Vlad's manifesto comes up as a non-Eurocentric approach to the question of the possible. So in conclusion, let's think that when we invoke the possible, and we're trying to rethink the possible, we are coming up against this long historical, complex historical, philosophical set of processes, and especially the notion of a single reality and a single world, so that when we are told the command, be realistic, what they are telling us is precisely to conform to that single notion of reality and to a very narrow set of possibles. So we need to become what you call in the project, I think you call it, what is it? A realist of a larger reality. I can't remember exactly. So basically, a realist of a pluriversal reality. So that's what I wanted to say to begin with. Thank you.
Thank you, Arturo. And I think my colleagues will be sharing in the chat the link to both Vlad's manifesto and to Arturo's work on possibilities and pluriverse. So keep an eye out for those. So Vlad, maybe you'd like to share your thoughts.
Yes, absolutely. And thank you so much, Keri, and everyone for the invitation. It's very hard to follow from Arturo because I took note of all these wonderful principles, and I can say I wholeheartedly agree, but I was also asked to think of points of difference. Maybe they won't come across as strongly in my introduction, but just to share a little bit about my background. So I'm trained as a psychologist, but I often feel I am an undercover philosopher, anthropologist, or at least I would like to be as well, and sociologist. So my work has been a lot in the area of creativity. And creativity itself, I'm not going to spend a lot of time on it as we talk mostly about imagination, but creativity always appealed to me because it has to do with the imagination, and then it has to do with making a change in the world. And I feel that for decades now, psychology has taken creativity as a topic and put it very firmly within the person, within the individual. So a lot of my work for the past 10, 15 years has been to develop this idea of distributed creativity and to think about how creativity exists in action and interaction rather than just within the mind. So I think, looking at the mind is always something of interest to me. I am in the end indeed a psychologist, but it is always the mind in context. And what's appealed to me with the notion of the possible, this is something that, it's an interest I developed over the past 5 years, let's say, because I was thinking, what drew me to creativity? Why did I study creativity for a number of years? And my answer for myself, and luckily for other people who have joined in these networks and encyclopedias and journal that you have a link in the chat now, too, is really this amphibious existence, I would call it, that we live at the same time within the here and now, and within the then and there, the elsewhere, the nowhere even. And I think when we create, when we imagine, when we act agentically, we tap into the coordination, the articulation between the real, the possible, and the impossible. And the field of possibility studies emerged as this wonderful, very kind of new, but also extremely old idea, as Keri very nicely reminded us, that draws on so many theories, and it's truly a transdisciplinary field that looks at how we become aware of, explore, and enact or choose not to enact, which is a big topic I think we might come back to. When should we not turn the possible into something real, as individuals and communities and collectives, and even beyond the human register? And just very briefly, my own approach to the possible. What is the possible? It's very hard to define. To me, it's really everything that exists kind of beyond the here and now of immediate experience, but of course grows out of this immediate experience and transforms it altogether. The fact that we can engage with possibility completely transforms our experience of whatever we might call reality of the here and now. So as a socioculturalist, as was mentioned before, and as a committed pragmatist, that's kind of my philosophical approach. My starting point is the notion of difference, and I think it's wonderfully connecting now with the notion of plurality. I often talk about multiplicity, especially multiplicity of perspectives. What I find interesting, and I think through today we came across and we tried collectively to question all these big dichotomies: the real or the actual and the possible and the impossible. For me, these are in many ways false dichotomies. Again, the real and the possible, they coexist, they feed from each other, they transform each other. So for me, what's very interesting to think about is this dynamic of sameness and differentiation and diversity. And again, from a psychological and not only perspective, the possible erupts within our experience of the world when we come to realize that the world is perspectival, that there are multiple ways to think, engage with, or simply be in the world. This notion of multiplicity is extremely important, and I use a lot of the vocabulary of perspectives, and for me, perspective is not something in the head, but it is really an action orientation. It's an orientation towards the world, towards self and others. And I also talk about positioning and positions, and I think that one of the most wonderful things, because I'm trained as a socioculturalist, but as a social psychologist originally, is this fact that we emerge as the self because we can take distance from our position in the world, because we can look at the world, including ourselves, through the prism of another position. We can become other, as it were. So these are ideas that really concern me when we think about possibility. And just to end, because I can't wait for the conversation, I think they do have deep implications when it comes to the ethical, the ethics of possibility, and the political. And of course, Arturo outlined beautifully, a lot of this political side and ethical side. But just to add, what is the ethics of difference? How can we authentically engage? As psychologists, I'm genuinely interested in how we become aware of differences and what we make of them, above and beyond the simple idea of openness to difference and openness to experience and whatever other criteria and variables we use in psychology. But what does it mean to experience difference as an engine, as a kind of an atom of possibility? So I'm going to leave it at this, and yeah, look forward to the dialogue.
Thank you both for such rich contributions. I want to just give you a chance. Arturo, you were nodding away there, and I think you've both nodded at each other. I just wonder if you want to respond to anything in particular that Vlad just said.
Yes, I'll be pleased. I'll be eager to do that, actually.
Yep.
It's very provocative, and maybe three things, and with one or two questions. The first one is about, I really like the question of distributed creativity and distributed agency. Is a notion that goes very well with the notion of relationality, of interdependence. Everything is interdependent. Everything exists because everything else exists. So this story of separation from modernity, which in philosophical terms is called a dualist ontology of separations, is really nonsense. The real foundation of life is relationality, interdependence. And we can see it carefully stated in the notion of creativity. One question in relation to that concept, Vlad, for me is, how do you relate creativity to innovation, which is the big word in international development, in everything is now about innovation and becoming innovators and entrepreneurs. My provocation would be, is innovation a colonization of creativity? Okay. Second comment, similar, the amphibiousness nature of human existence today. We are in the here and now. We are embodied beings, place-based beings. We cannot exist just nowhere in our heads, but we're also increasingly delocalized. We're also increasingly elsewhere, always in the global space, you know, in the virtual space, going to different planets. You know, you're Jeff Bezos and have billions of dollars in your pocket. So how do you reconcile this, the need, the sort of the social existence condition of being here and now, of being embodied and localized, with the tendencies to delocalization introduced by globalization? And the third one is about difference and plurality, which is, to me, is the starting point of everything. I mean, life is difference. I think I've always been concerned with both difference and inequality. I think those are the two overriding concerns in my life. And so difference and plurality, the same. Do you see that there is a tendency towards saming, towards homogenizing? Despite the heterogeneity of the world, is there an overall tendency to homogenize and to normalize individuals to behave more according to as individuals, according to markets, etc.? And what does it say about the possible?
Okay, I'm going to jump in. You've got three really fantastic questions there, and actually they relate to some of the ones that I wanted to ask of you both. Specifically, this question of the relationship between creativity and innovation and the capture of innovation and possibility within certain discourses ties to some of my questions about the proximity of the discourse of possibility with, for example, neoliberal economic frames with the potential for self-exploitation. How does that tie together? So that to me is one thing that I think the three of us could drill into, and I'll hold the other two, because I think if we try and answer all of them at once, we're going to sit at a top level. So let's drill down. So let's think about the dark side, the potential for co-option of this word possibility, and what does it take to resist that, to prevent that co-option? So,
yeah, that's a wonderful question, and you know, in the first issues of the journal, is going to come up. There are colleagues who actively question, you know, and point to the danger of falling into, or people having this idea that the possible, you know, it's like a slogan. It's a bit of a marketing slogan, and I sometimes collect these and see what you know marketing does with this. But definitely the aim, I mean, my aim has always been to rescue concepts. You know, that's why I started working on creativity. I was fully aware that it is a modern, very Western value, and that we talk for the past few decades about creativity because it is tied very much to the economy, but it shouldn't be only to the economy. It is about well-being. It is about being in the world. My thesis, when I started, you know, I did my PhD on creativity, just to give you an idea of how you can subvert that, hopefully. I was not interested in individual creativity, in genius level creativity, but I studied Easter egg decoration practices. So decorated eggs in the north of Romania. So my interest was precisely to question the separation between creativity and tradition, the body and the mind, you know, what is novelty and what is the old. And I think just to talk about innovation a little bit, absolutely, innovation is taking over as the new kind of preferred concept for marketing and the economy and all of that. And I think one of the most interesting dichotomies here for me as a psychologist, really, it's about idea generation and idea implementation. A lot of people, the easiest definition people use of creativity and innovation to distinguish them is that creativity is about coming up with ideas, as if ideas exist somewhere in ethereal space, and they're very disembodied, and, you know, just a moment of insight, nothing before, nothing after. And innovation is about implementing them, making something of them. But how can we ever implement something without getting new ideas, without envisioning new possibilities? So for me, it is very much a false dichotomy that again reinforces, as Arturo and others have said today, all of these big dichotomies, mind and body. You know, who in society is supposed to be the creative class and the ideator, and who is supposed to be the implementer? So I think there is a lot of work to be done to rescue these concepts and also to put possibility studies on a good footing when it comes to these histories.
Is there something, I'm thinking about Arturo's framing of this, talking about the history that we exist within. Is there something about the temporality of, as Arturo knows, I'm obsessed with temporality. Is there something about the temporality of possibility that if it is located only in relation to the future, this language of the new and the innovation, but doesn't engage with the histories and contexts of which it's a part, that it becomes deracinated, that it becomes something that can be co-opted there? Is there anything around the sort of temporality of possibility that we need to be thinking about carefully when we think about its resistance, if you like, to simply being co-opted to the latest set of ideas?
Absolutely, and I do want to give room to Arturo. I'm sure he has many more insights on this, but just to say that some areas that I'm interested in, and colleagues as well, possible pasts is a fascinating area. I mean, in psychology, we talk a lot about counterfactuals and counterfactual thinking when you think about what could have been. But that is such an intimate part of life. The past is a domain of possibility and creativity. And I'm fully aware here of the dangers of post-truth, changing the past, misinformation. I mean, there is the darker side that I know you, Keri, want to talk about. But the past is a domain of possibility, the present, not to mention the self, you know, possible societies, possible worlds, possible selves. So I think part of that project is exactly to not see only the future, because there is that risk, as you mentioned, I would think.
Arturo?
Yes. Yeah. Let me begin with the last concept that Vlad mentioned, which is a possible pasts. And I think this is, in a way, it's a hugely important task as well, because we can look at the past for instances where other kinds of worldviews, other kinds of ontologies, other kinds of ways of worlding, or turning the world into a livable entity, operated on a very different basis. What do I mean by that? Operated on the basis that did not, let me put it this way, on a non-liberal, non-capitalist basis, and maybe even non-patriarchal. Patriarchy is much older. What I mean by that, not on the basis of the single individual, but more communally oriented persons, not on the basis of just individual private property, but also commons and commonly held collective economies, different kinds of economies, not on the basis of the single reality, but acknowledging multiple realities and multiple reals. So acknowledging the difference that inhabits any social space in which we exist. So the question of decolonizing the past as well is very important. It has to do with the question of time. How do we see time otherwise? How do we see the times of peoples who has not lived with the notion of linear time that can be accumulated, that time is money, that we're going always in a straight line towards a single possible future, or if not the single possible future, at least the best that we can predict through science. So all of these elements are there in the past already. I mean, the past was mostly inhabited, characterized by other ways of being. It's only in the past 500 years that this way of being that is more disembodied, delocalizing, decommunalizing, individualizing, and economizing has been set into place and progressively set into place. So in the past, we can find instances of that, and that's very important. Go ahead, Keri.
I wanted to hook in precisely to the question of place, which I think was the second point that you raised for Vlad, and is one that I wanted us to get to. A lot of the discussions as part of the imagination infrastructuring work is around working in place and what's the role of place in fostering different sorts of imagination. So I wonder if you could both talk a little bit about how you see place as a powerful actor in possibility thinking in the imagination. Whichever one of you wants to go first.
Should I say a few words about the positioning and positions, because that is part of place, that is part of landscape of being located voluntarily or by others. But also for me, another big interest, just throwing another concept in the mix that relates to temporality, isn't it? Mobility. And one of the big inspirations for me as I started with others possibility studies was this mobility shift. And this idea that we should look not at instances as much as the flux, the movement between. And I think what spaces allow us to do is to notice how we are positioned, but also how our positioning changes and how we move around space. That to me is the beginning of opening up possibilities. You remember I mentioned perspectives. How do you gain a new perspective? By adopting a new position. How do you adopt a new position? By moving within space. And to my mind, these are quite intimately connected.
Okay, I agree completely. And one way to put it is that we need to get back into place. This is actually the title of a book by philosopher William Casey that I used a long time ago. It's a book from the 90s, I believe. Get back into place. We are being summoned by place again. Given the ecological crisis, the devastation of places, the delocalization pressures, the erosion of the here and now of human existence, we are being summoned by place again to become connected to place. That doesn't mean, sometimes I make a distinction between place-based, but not place-bound. And I think it's related to what Vlad was saying, is people are moving, and especially the young people want to move. They want to have the world as their theater of operation, so to speak. And there is something powerful about that, but there is also something problematic. So how do we accomplish a balance between being place-based, but not place-bound? Because all places are also shaped by globality. And that allows for movement of people, but it allows also for commitment to place, especially on the parts of those who really want to be genuinely committed to working in place, for regeneration of place. And regeneration is another hugely important emergent concept, regenerative design, regenerative this and that. So the question of place, again, is going to become increasingly important. How do we reconceptualize place for the new so-called global era?
Yeah, to me, this is where I can see a difference in your take on this. So I read in Arturo's work about the going deep into place as a site of almost a sort of archaeological, it's not surprising really, Arturo, it's an anthropological kind of location going deep. And from Vlad, I hear a different temporal metaphor, that shifting place allows you to see something differently. But I wonder whether one of those is a geographical shifting and the other one is a temporal shifting, and engaging deep with history, the ability to go deep and to fetch what has been left behind in that phrase Sankofa that is so powerful in Ghanaian framings. So to me, that is where there is a tension with the two of you. Do we perceive possibility as we go deeper, as we sink into a place and see its sediments and its layers? Do we perceive possibility as we shift ourselves outside of it and look at it from the outside? And Vlad, I think quite a lot of your work, the sociocultural psychology framing is quite often, what's special about humans is that we can step outside and look at ourselves. But actually, is there a tension between those two positions, or are they both strategies, different strategies?
Can I take this first, because it's a perfect question, and I remember writing at some point about creativity that it is immersed detachment, and I think this is the tension that has been a lot in my work. Coming back to Easter egg decoration and the craft immerses you into something, into a practice. People lose track of time. In psychology and outside, we use this notion of flow, being in flow. Anyway, it comes with its own assumptions. But there is this dynamic that is wonderful between immersion and detachment. And you're absolutely right to say, Keri, that in a sociocultural framework, this notion of detachment and taking a step back or looking back at is very important. But what is detachment without immersion? I talk about perspectives, and I've done some work with colleagues around perspective taking. Perspective taking is a wonderful phenomenon. I mean, we wouldn't have a conversation now if we didn't try to approximate when the other tries to speak, and it's fundamental for almost everything. But how do we build perspectives? Is it like this superficial act of I'm imagining, I'm just quickly stepping out and seeing you from the outside, or do I really try to understand, immerse myself into your life experience? do I identify or do I just use stereotypes to take perspective? So I think the value of immersion cannot be underestimated. And while I do talk a lot about reflexivity because distance allows you reflexivity, it has to be grounded. So I'm trying to navigate that balance as well.
Same here, although maybe as an anthropologist, and Keri was asking us before we started, maybe to talk a little bit about our different backgrounds. Sometimes people talk about anthropology in two ways. Anthropology has two aspects to it: to render the unfamiliar familiar. So traditionally, Margaret Mead went to Samoa and then wrote to make familiar what was very unfamiliar to the West, a very different way of being. But also to render the familiar unfamiliar, to denaturalize the familiar. And that has taken the form of an anthropology of modernity. So that's why I'm a bit obsessed, and I recognize this is probably Latin American obsession, with unpacking modernity. What has it been? And of course, a great deal of modern philosophers, Foucault and Habermas and everybody else, has been doing that, but within the discourse of the West for the most part. So how do we do it from outside the West? So that's one thing. And I'm all for the notion of immersive creativity. There's a similar notion from Francisco Varela, a wonderful Chilean cognitive scientist, of embodied reflection. For Varela, complete detachment, separation is nonsense. So this idea of the conventional epistemology of science, of the total detachment of the observer from the observed, is nonsense. It was already criticized by cybernetics and, phenomenology and all these different things, but it continues to be so prominent, so important, and so influential. So I like the fact that we can have both immersion and detachment that is not 100% detachment, because it comes after immersion. It is embedded within that.
This is lovely. I mean, if we come back to the topic of our work here, which is imagination infrastructure, infrastructures, can be conceived of as place-based, but they're also networked. They're also connections. They're also always boundaries and have borders that interfaces with others. So this sense of, for us as our practice, I mean, taking these ideas, the practice of building an imagination infrastructure, then when I hear your two phrases of immersive creativity and embodied reflection, there is something about sinking into place, but also maintaining dialogue, always also being in relation. So that horizontal and that vertical move that I find kind of beautiful. So thank you for that. I want to take you somewhere else now, both of you. Quite often when we're hearing the word possibility, it can be sort of yoked to this idea of hope. Okay, so you've got to have hope. And so possibility and hope get pulled together, but sometimes actually, I mean, a lot of the conversations we've been having today have been about the importance of maybe letting some things go, of hope to kind of maintain things not being where we're at. So I suppose I really want you to talk through a little bit with me, perhaps the sense of the affective side, the emotional questions associated with questions of possibility, and where you see those relationships, and perhaps where you see the relationship between, say, hope or despair and possibility. Where does that come up in your work? No big questions we're asking today. We're just asking the easy ones.
Keri's getting us into trouble now.
I know, sorry. Crack on.
Well, maybe I can say something quick, since Vlad has been beginning. Give him a little bit of time. I like the notion of Joanna Macy. Some of you might know who she is. She's a wonderful, now she's close to 90-year-old system biologist, feminist, lives in California, and transitioner. She talks about active hope. So we cannot have hope in the abstract. We cannot have hope that the world is not going to collapse because of climate change. We have to have active hope, a hope that is from action, as Vlad would say, that is immersed in action. So that's one thing. Second, that said, nevertheless, it's so important to have hope. Hope is a very political act. And how do we create hope, especially among young people who are more accustomed to or more prone to get into despair because of the news, because of the war in Ukraine, because the world is going to hell, blah, 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 and all these different things. So creating a sense of active hope connected to a real sense of politics, a grounded sense of politics, which means engaging in struggle. It doesn't have to be the great social movement. It can be small transition town initiative in your town. I mean, that's that we know how transition town and Rob Hopkins' work has become because of that. It's a politics of hope as well. It's a politics of hope that is grounded in what is real. So other possibles are possible. That giving a chance to that other possibility, that remaking locality, towns, to become towns that operate on the basis of a different philosophy of life, if you wish, I think is super important.
Thanks, Arturo.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I was just making some notes that, you know, hope is so dangerous for authoritarian regimes and for all these kind of ontologies of sameness and identity. And the only version of the world is that, the only perspective is this. It is very dangerous for those in power, because hope means that there is something to hope for. There is something alternative to what is. And whenever I hear hope, I immediately go to Rebecca Solnit's Hope in the Dark, and exactly this idea of action and hope. Hope and action are not. If you feel hope, it means that there is an element of action into it. Otherwise, you'd just be fantasizing or you know, pondering. But one thing about emotion and possibility, I mean, I would be fascinated. I would love for this to be an ongoing conversation about the emotions of the possible, as I like to call them, because there's not only hope, but it's opposite in a way, despair, maybe not opposite, but it's other, or anxiety. Anxiety fascinates me. I have to say, again, as a social psychologist, I didn't do much on the clinical psychotherapy side, but I've read, you know, existentialist philosophy and phenomenology and so on. And what fascinates me is these notions of anxiety as a positive state. Of course, there are limits to how much anxiety we can take. But anxiety means we did not give up. And of course, there are many, you know, Heidegger, who, of course, with all the good and the bad could be mentioned here, about being in time, speaking again of time, and being as an open project involves anxiety. Anxiety means that something else is possible, that we try and we yearn and we're driving towards that. But it's risky, you know, hope is risky, living is risky, and there is always that to be acknowledged. So I think I'm fascinated by how we can take these negative states that a lot of times we need to be very much sheltered from, and relate them back to the sense of the possible.
Arturo, do you want to respond?
Yes, add something very brief. So I wonder, Vlad, this as a proposition, as a provocation.
Please.
Yes, I agree with you. Anxiety and being and breakdowns even could have a very positive role to play in social transformation and personal transformation. How would you think about this proposition that the cure to anxiety, I don't even know if I want to use the word cure, but let's say for now, is care. And this is again Heidegger, but also the feminist theories of care. So that when we jump into care, which is also a fundamental aspect of being, and more people are talking about this than ever before, perhaps, then we can deal with that anxiety in a creative way through action. And I use jumping into care literally in a sense, because you have to immerse yourself into a situation, get out of the individual mindset that experiences the anxiety. This is the Buddhist, I guess, meaning to that as well. Getting out of that anxiety and put into perspective. And put into perspective means being able to understand the interdependence of everything, including we are interdependent. If we're interdependent, we need to care for the webs of interdependencies of which we are part. So from anxiety to care and love, literally. I mean, we are made to be felt that we are not loved today outside of our immediate family circle, but how we try to recover the ability to feel, not only to give, but also to feel that we are loved by larger webs of life, including maybe non-humans.
Yeah, completely. I mean, I was thinking now about what causes that anxiety, right? I mean, the openness of the future, the possibilities can cause anxiety, even this motivating state of I have to act, you know, in psychology, we call this state of arousal, of excitation. But very interesting, this notion of care, because, you know, going back to creativity just for a moment, a lot of the burnout in the creative industries, and not only a lot of this pressure that people put on themselves when they are creatives and labeled as such, comes out of this very individualistic assumption that creativity is within them. They either have it or not. If they fail, it means that they probably don't have it, and there is no way around it. So I think anxieties that relate to this being completely alone and separated in the world can be very damaging. And as you said, you know, just acknowledging this relatedness, interdependence, is a way of feeling anxiety, but feeling that we share the space for action, the space for hope, and the space for responsibility as well. That we have a common responsibility. So I think the source and the kind of symptoms of this anxiety do vary a lot.
Mm-hmm.
I think that's, I love this conversation, because this question about the relationship between possibility and safety, because the reverse of possibility might be security. You know, what's the reverse? It's not possibility, it's that you might just be fixed. It's a kind of concept of fixity, which is predictable, which might create safety. So this question of how one can feel secure or create a sense of security with possibility seems absolutely critical. And I wonder if the flip of that is also something, so this is where my background as an educator comes out, is to that sense of the joy and pleasures of not knowing. How do we create a conversation that doesn't frame unknowing and possibility as a site of risk only? And I speak, you know, the future studies field, much of it is concerned with identifying potential risks and figuring out how you handle them, how you handle them. So I think there's something about actually recognizing the joyful nature of these sorts of possibilities. I want to do a little shout out for a couple of people that I think are really important in this conversation around creativity and this kind of collective ownership. So the first is a wonderful woman called Vera John Steiner, who's a sociocultural psychologist, wrote an amazing book called Creative Collaborations about 25 years ago, that makes visible that our sense of possibility is always held in webs of relation with other people. Mm-hmm. And to pick up your point, Arturo, that sense of, I agree with you. I don't think we pull people into the world and tell them that they are held and they are loved. I think there's a huge amount of experience as all sorts of institutions and structures and practices break down that invite us to focus in on the individual or the family as the site of safety and security. So here's a slightly random question that has just occurred to me. What would the ritual practices be, or the institutional practices that could create that attention to, that awareness of being part of community, of being part of relation? Do you know of any, or do you think we maybe need to, as part of our imagination infrastructure, start developing the sorts of rituals and social practices that allow us to feel connected, to be connected in the world in the way that, you know, older religion practices might have done it in the past? Any suggestions?
Wonderful big question. Arturo, do you want to go first as well?
Let me try to say a couple of things. I think there are many, again, we can look at the past for rituals of interdependence, rituals of community. I'm wary of using the term community because it has also been associated with rigidity and patriarchy and hierarchy and all those different things. And actually existing communities are that as well, but they are not only that. They are also connections and care and all these different things, many of which we have lost in modern middle-class urbanized worlds, that in which we live as competitive individuals in our cubicles, and we don't have the opportunity for any rituals of connection. So rituals of connection is very important. There's a concept in Latin America, which is communality, comunalidad. And communality speaks about the fact that the human experience is always deeply communal, and it has been throughout history. Until the last 200 years, even in Western Europe, even in the West itself, there are what we call non-dominant Wests, of alternative Wests. So these are the Wests of activists, of degrowth, and the commons, and the neo-pagans and neo-shamans, shamanic, and there's all a search for those rituals of the communal and of interconnectedness and independence. So that's one thing. The second is how we really go against rituals that allows us to heal from that ideology that we are all competitive individuals. That then we have to, and there's the question of security, Keri, that is very pertinent, of safety. We only feel safe in our individualizing ways. So that's why we try to accumulate as much as we can, because it's the only way to feel safe in this world, in this day and age. It's sad, but it is. But it's an illusion, it's a mirage, because that's a very superficial way of feeling safe, that the super rich can afford to do that. But for most humans, that possibility is not there, really. And yet we aim for that. We aim for that security. So we aim for the model of the middle class urban life, including in the suburbs and so forth. And that's a very damaging, it's actually for me, is one of the main sort of design challenges, is how do we move away from this ideal of design, urban design, based on gateway communities, self-enclosed and policed, living enclaves, that condominiums that are ubiquitous in Latin America, at least. Anyways, I could say more about that, but
just to echo, I mean, I know you work a lot on critiquing patriarchy, but it seems to me that the feminist traditions of asking questions about the way families are organized seem absolutely central to that reframing and rethinking that you're talking about.
yes.
Brad, you've had a bit of time now.
I had a bit of time.
What's your ritual?
many ideas came to my mind. Well, I mean, my first ritual has to do with craft. I mean, this is really my first love, and something that taught me, in a way, so much of what I've been thinking since then, because craft to me is this big thirdness. You know, we often think of art and science, at least in creativity. You know, when you think of creative domains, the arts, the sciences, and then you have craft and everyday living, and crafting also an existence that is the thirdness, the space of possibility and connection. You know, of course, there is a craft to the arts and there is a craft to science, so it's a very inclusive category. But if I think of rituals, you know, these all the things related to community life. Another notion that is very dear to me is Simon's notion of sociability. The fact that we come together for some particular purpose, but on top of that, we come together for the joy and playfulness of being with others. And that takes me also back, and I wanted to make this point, I'm happy I can somehow, about security. You know, in psychology, we talk a lot about secure attachment. And that's a part of psychology, developmental science, gets us back to time, that really has so many insights, because a lot of the things we talk about as how do we experience possibility and so on, we need to look at the ontogenetic history, the life course history of those. A lot of them go back to attachment, they go back to play, they go back to pretend play, and they go back to this interplay between feeling safe and exploring the world. I mean, the whole idea of secure attachment is not to be fixated, it's not security, but it's secure exploration, it's managing the tension. So I think any institution, any ritual, any context that can help us you know, explore safely and hold on to the tension and work productively with it would be positive. Which are these spaces? Well, that is something to discover and to co-construct, I think, more than just name them.
I was thank you for that. And I mean, this is where I think that the conversations across these two different traditions could be really generative. This question of drawing on life course history as well as on colonial history, for example, both of these seem really important. I'm also noticing in the chat comments about music. And actually, I've seen, Arturo, you write a lot about music, and both of you talk about reality as this multi-layered, emergent, multi-rhythmic, diverse existence. And I just wonder whether either of you have anything to say about music in relation to providing access to this reality in a way that is so different from kind of modernist, linear, singular frames.
Should I try to go first?
Go.
The first thing that comes to mind, so I mentioned pragmatism as an inspiration, but another one is dialogism and Bakhtin and others. And polyphony is such an interesting notion to me because in the social sciences and in psychology, in my own work, if I'm to do my own critique here, I use very visual metaphors, and I think they relate a lot to the way, science is done and the way modernity, makes us think in terms of spaces and what is my space and other space and so on. But when it comes to music, there is an art of simultaneity. And what polyphony does is that voices coexist at the same time. You don't have to kind of make barriers or stop. And I think another thing that inspires me is dialogue, and that's human voices. And there is a kind of music and musicality to that as well. But what is most inspiring to me again about music is the simultaneity of difference and the way that is enacted. So yeah, that's one immediate thought.
Maybe another thought is that with music and dance, I can say that music and dance are an arts of connection, arts of interdependence, pluriversal arts. I'm interested in what we can call pluriversal arts, arts that exemplify, illustrate, display, enact, perform the pluriverse. And there is a bunch of kind of experiments going on here along those lines, and music can be part of that. And music is a ritual as well. Music is connection, and dance is connection. So it takes us out of our individual mind-body duality, and connects us to something that is different. And art and music can also be part of what Vlad called spaces for exploring safely these other ways of being, these other ways of organizing ourselves into communities, into worlds, into societies. So for me, a main question of design and design infrastructures for the imagination will be, how do we create safe spaces for experimentation, for innovation, for other rhythms of life, for reconnecting with each other. And we have a lot to learn as well, obviously, from indigenous traditions in this respect. I just noticed, going by quickly on the chat here on my screen, a comment about Minga. Minga is an indigenous South American or Latin American collective practice of collective labor, coming together to work, different groups of people in the field or building a house. The Amish do that as well, as a well-known case of whole community coming together. And again, we can romanticize communities, but the fact is that with all their difficulties and power relations, many of these other communities do have maintained practices that are practices of a different kind of possible and a different kind of real.
Okay, well, we could clearly carry on for at least the next 3 hours. We won't, because there's also some amazing other talks coming next. I suppose I'd like to close by asking you both to anchor this in your own practices and just to say something very briefly about how your sense of possibility shapes your way of being in the world.
Oops. Sorry.
Including being open to the possibility of new contacts through mobile phones.
Exactly, that is connection. Well, I will say, I will say a few words just in closing about what inspires me the most now, and it goes back to possibility studies and the sense of community of different voices in a polyphony coming together. I often use nowadays the metaphor, it's a very organic metaphor, of the forest and the trees. For a long time, I've been looking at the creativity tree, and it's an enormous tree. It's big and beautiful. It has many branches, and it has many roots in many disciplines and so on. But there is a huge forest around it. So my interest now is really to articulate all of these ideas and practices around agency, the imagination, innovation, improvisation, serendipity, wonder, awe, possibility, right? Utopias, dystopias. And I feel like this conference is giving that forest. So I'm very excited. It really increased my sense of possibility, and I'm very grateful for the invitation.
Arturo, any last reflection?
Okay. I cannot live without a sense of hope and possibility. And I think the World Social Forum, where they introduced the slogan, "Another world is possible," did a lot to reinvent possibility. And then we can say, well, many worlds are possible, not only another world, but many other worlds are possible. So that's politically is important to do that collectively with others, not just individually, but also collectively with others. And in terms of my own practice, well, I mean, I live in eco-housing right now in North Carolina, Chapel Hill, North Carolina, which is an attempt at rebuilding some sort of communality. And also in my current project in Colombia, which is a collective project with about 30 people, we're trying to reimagine our region in Colombia, devastated by 100 years of sugarcane monoculture and cattle ranching, into a very different kind of region, a pluriversal region. So another Cauca Valley is possible. That's our slogan, and that's the name of it for the region.
Thank you both for a really fabulous conversation. I hope it will carry on, and I look forward to talking with you much longer and much deeper around all of this. And I'm sure that everybody who heard it got a huge amount from it. So thanks so much for your time and your care with all of this. Thank you.
Thank you, Keri, Vlad.
Thank you so much, Keri, Arturo, and Vlad. You started us off by sharing with us conceptions of reality and the real, as well as the ways in which reality is narrowed and narrows our sense of possibility. You spoke about how reality is a simplification of the more complex real, and how the real and the possible coexist, how multiplicity is an orientation towards the world. We explored the kind of relationship between being here and now, as well as displacement, the potential for co-option of these ideas around possibility and how to rescue them, rooted us in place, but also took us how not to be place bound. There was an exploration of possibility, hope, despair, anxiety, relationships between possibility and safety, and the joyful nature of possibility. There's so much to cover, and you guys have covered so much, and I'm sure this is one of those that many people come back to absorb slowly. It is now time for a break. We will be back at 4:30. Thank you so much, and see you soon.